In this video, we're going to talk about the attunement element of being a part of a skillful interaction. So, whereas presence might imply a kind of opening toward, attunement really kind of implies a focusing in, right? So these two things kind of go hand in hand, but we're opening toward and focusing in intentionally with the person we're interacting with or people we're interacting with. So an important part of this, important ability really that we all have, is to actually use our bodies as instruments of picking up these signals of the inner world of the person we're focusing into. So this is something we've practiced before using the body scanning exercise, being aware as possible of the sensation information, the kind of sensory data of our bodies, and letting those things inform how we speak and act, or how we know what it is that we're actually going through or feeling. The reason that this is an optimal choice is that our bodies naturally and automatically and very quickly tend to simulate what we think is going on in the inner world of another. There are specific brain cells in our brain called mirror neurons, which are theorized to be a part of a system of empathy, of the ability to have empathy, where these neurons, these mirror neurons, kind of guess at the intentional state, the inner world of the person we're with, and then it responds by making the body change in certain physiological ways to simulate that guess. And it leads us even to imitate behaviors of the people we're around if we're kind of attuned, really closely attuned to them, if we're focusing in on them, in other words. This is most evident and when you're in a deep conversation with someone, say, and you might notice sort of facing each other in a similar way, kind of taking on their tone of voice as the story goes in different directions. Or if you watch others in a close conversation, sometimes one person will cross their leg and the other person will do it too. And it's kind of an unconscious thing. They're actually literally mirroring one another. And this is a result of an opening toward and a focusing in. And we'll talk more about that result, that resonance, in the next video. But what this ability of ours to absorb the internal states or the intentional states of others, and then to kind of use the body as an instrument of detecting those intentional states of others is really quite crucial. It's important, however, to acknowledge that how to skillfully do this involves being able to differentiate ourselves first and then link to that intentional state of the other. We can't, in other words, just dive in and let ourselves be taken by the intentional state of another person. In other words, we can't get lost in their emotions. We have to have a firm footing, from which to do that. But that's a part of having those mature functions that I mentioned earlier in relation to attachment. So, as this is going on, what I would like to suggest you try on as a kind of set of skills related to what's called active listening. And this is something that I'm going to unpack a little bit in detail, but it's really something that happens quite quickly, and it's not really cumbersome to use in real time as you get used to it. But these several kind of steps or components can be useful to practice on their own so that they become kind of natural and automatic. And then over time, you might notice yourself using them more effortlessly and more quickly. So what active listening kind of has as its intention is to promote this open focusing in. It's to promote presence and attunement to another person or to other people. So the first step of active listening, roughly, the first element of it is to simply pay attention. That's intentionally building in that presence we talked about last time. Doing your best to authentically be there is a really important ingredient in this. Authenticity, as I've mentioned, is just really an important part of building skillful habits of interaction. The second step is demonstrating that you're paying attention. And the way that we demonstrate, by and large, is due to or relying upon nonverbal skills we've talked about also. So nodding your head and opening your eyes a little bit more, letting your face be open to what's going on, smiling or what have you. So the nonverbals that I mentioned, your eye contact, facial expression, tone of voice, gesture, posture, timing, and intensity of voice, but also the use of silence. Silence isn't often considered kind of an important ingredient in conversations, but when you're discussing something or interacting with someone and there is a pause, those pauses tend to be what we might think of as pregnant pauses. There's something that can come out of them, and if we're patient enough to allow those pauses, those silences to be present, sometimes the person we're interacting with fills that silence with something that you didn't have to dig out of them, something that's they invited themselves into that silence to fill. And silence is a hard thing to build in as a part of a classroom environment. Admittedly, that's a really challenging thing to do. But there are ways that I think you can probably find the most adaptable place for the use of silence, even small little pieces of silence. And maybe experiment with one-on-one interactions first. Do that. Now, as we demonstrate our attention or our presence, providing feedback is important too. And what I mean by this isn't that we're actually responding with our own thoughts and opinions quite yet. We're still actively listening, gathering information as we interact with others. But what providing feedback really means is just saying and doing things to let the person know that we're with them, that we're following them. And so what I recommend experimenting with is using restate, reflect, and validate as kind of like orienting points. You know, this is just suggested points, but I've also, on a handout that I've shared with you, suggested kind of starter phrases. If you really want to intentionally use something like a restatement, simply saying, so what I'm hearing you say is a really easy thing to say, and it sets a tone that is formal but also comfortable, and you can get the information you need really directly. With reflect, it seems that you feel is a good one to use, because you're not attempting to pinpoint as much as offering a hypothesis, a guess of what the other person's inner world is. And that's kind of the idea of, as we mentioned, attunement, of not only opening up but focusing in toward their inner experience. So you seem to feel is a good way of kind of inviting clarification, so that you know more in detail and overtly what the other person's inner experience is. That's a lot of good information. You know, we're using our bodies as detectors. We're hearing, so to speak, or feeling this information from within ourselves to inform us, but also we're trying to use the information of the other person's experience, of their bodily sensations, of their thoughts, and taking a guess at what they might be feeling in the moment and asking them if that's the case and letting them correct it. It's a lot of good information that make interactions really rich. And validate. Validate is crucial, because after we gather all that information, the other person's watching us, thinking of what we're thinking about with that information. And simply saying a quick phrase, it makes sense to me that you would feel this way. Even if you don't agree with them, even if you think that what they did as a result was inappropriate or wrong, you don't have to think that what they did was good or how they think about it is accurate. Just, okay, well, it makes sense to me that if you think this way, you would feel this way about it. Validating just quenches a thirst for all of us, no matter your age. To feel validated means to feel felt, to feel heard, and to feel deeply acknowledged. And that's a good feeling, like a wholesomely good feeling that's important and healthy. And it also kind of lends itself to opening up more and more and more. We, in other words, can feel more available to others who we feel validated around. So as we provide feedback, we're also going to be doing our best as we actively listen to defer judgment. So we're going to kind of suspend any potential critical thought about what we're hearing so far. Judgment in terms of discernment is not a bad thing. We have to make discernments. We have to make judgments of what we should and shouldn't do or say, or how we should advise others, especially young people. But making critical judgments while we're gathering information is kind of like putting the cart before the horse. We collect this data, and as we collect it, we're doing our best to suspend the judgments that we might notice automatically coming up. And as we're doing that, we're taking on the stance of unconditional positive regard that I've mentioned before. This doesn't require you to think that what you're hearing and seeing is good or accurate or helpful or beneficial or right. It simply means that it directs you to adopt an attitude of understanding that makes sense. What you're hearing and seeing makes sense given that person's context and experience and how they think about things. And as you do that, those few steps, you pay attention, you demonstrate that attention, you provide feedback, maybe more verbally, and as you're doing that, you're kind of deferring judgment. Then you've gathered a lot of information, and this happens fast, in just a few seconds even. But then you respond appropriately. This might be where you actually set in some discerning remarks or suggestions or urgings or even commands. And so there's a kind of spectrum of how we might respond appropriately after we gather the information from the person. And keep in mind, again, I'm outlining this in more detail, but this is really a 2 to 5 second window of time that this can all occur in. So to respond appropriately, we may, on one side of the spectrum, just provide encouragement and reassurance. Provide statements like, I noticed that this happened, I appreciate the way that you did this, just good jobs, those kinds of things. Suggestions are a little more directive, pointing, the individual or the group toward a direction based on what you've heard that you think would be better for them. And it's open, it's still open, but using phrases like, I wonder what would happen if, you headed in this direction, or you felt this way about it. It invites them to challenge themselves more, but it doesn't require you to stop them and correct them. It actually promotes critical thinking skills on their part too. On the more directive side of the spectrum of response, advice. This is a little more direct than suggestion, but it's not a command or demanding. It's, I think you should do this. I've heard you. I think I've heard how you feel, and that makes sense, but I think this should happen instead. You're sharing your opinion about whatever the situation is or however the response came about, and you're encouraging them to go a different direction, a little more directly. And lastly, sometimes we, maybe often even, depending on who we're working with and what time we're working with and what's going on, we might actually need to command, right now, I need you to do this. And there's no more discussion about, other options or anything like that. Sometimes that's required. And being a part of the active listening in that is still essential. You, as fully as you can, pay attention, show that attention, provide feedback, even deferring judgment as you're hearing things that you disagree with. And then after you've collected all that information in an open and honest way, if you decide, this still has to happen now, then saying, right now, do this in a more stern, forceful kind of authoritative way. That's really required sometimes. But just knowing that when it's required and using it intentionally, right? That's really the essence of this approach. Using active listening to collect all the information that you can, to discern what level of directiveness your response should be. If it should be just reassuring and non-directive at all, or gently nudging toward one way or another, or if it's a situation that has to be stopped and changed. And if that's the case, then, using it intentionally. That can provide us more direct influence in younger people's lives and those interactions, and it can prevent a lot from, as they say, bringing a cannon to a knife fight. If we're commanding constantly, even when we could be suggesting or we could be giving advice in that moment, with a little more openness for them to make their own decisions, then we're just bringing the cannons all the time. That's a lot easier said than done, especially in a busy, fast-paced, even crowded or just active classroom. Commands are really frequently felt to be needed, and that may be the case sometimes. But what this kind of a practice can do, and remember this is something just to experiment with, is to make those few moments of interactions where you're gathering information and then having to respond to an individual or a group, we're making those optimized so that your responses are more well-informed. You give yourself that chance to be more well-informed, and then they're also more skillfully or intentionally chosen. Your responses are more crafted in a way. You design them purposefully on your own, and you know what they're, why you might respond in one way or another. So, in the spirit of kind of investigating this attunement aspect of being a part of a skillful interaction, do your best to try to even kind of internalize some of these starter phrases if you want, or if you want to do it more openly, just kind of look over the elements of active listening as I've put them forward today, and try to experiment with them, play with them in your interactions. And play is so important here. You're giving yourself the chance to kind of be in wonder about what's going to happen when I change this, or put a wrench here in this spoke, or even surprise the students I'm working with by responding in this way rather than that way. And just as it's been shown time and time again how important play is in the process of learning for children and adolescents, the way adults learn in play or experiment with that kind of intriguing, open investigation for the sake of just seeing what will happen. It's a pretty important part of how we learn too as we age. So go through these and experiment with them, and try to maintain that playful attitude as you begin to manipulate and change or recalibrate little pieces of these small slivers, these small valuable slivers of interactions with the young people you come in contact with.